Leora's fingers moved across the holographic interface without conscious direction, muscle memory guiding her through 17 years of identical morning routines. The archive's data streams flowed past her vision in familiar patterns: human settlement expansion rates, linguistic drift calculations, updated neural mapping from the surveillance networks scattered across 14 colonies. She absorbed information the way her species always had, completely clinically, without the contamination of subjective interpretation. The station's atmospheric processors hummed at their usual frequency, a sound so constant she'd stopped registering it years ago. Her workspace occupied a curved section of the archive's outer ring, observation windows offering views of the debris field that surrounded them, asteroid fragments caught in perpetual orbit, their surfaces scarred by millennia of collisions. Beautiful, in an abstract way, she documented that observation in her personal logs once, then deleted it. Beauty suggested emotional response. The sisterhood didn't observe through emotional filters. Her reflection ghosted across the interface's surface when the screens dimmed between data packets. She studied it dispassionately. Features arranged in proportions her species considered standard, skin carrying the faint luminescence that marked full genetic integration with the archive's modified atmosphere. Eyes adapted for processing visual information across broader spectrums than human biology allowed. Functional, efficient, exactly what 300 years of selective breeding and cultural refinement had designed her to be. The morning briefing chimed through her neural link. She dismissed the previous night's sleep cycle data, perfectly adequate as always, and opened the priority queue. Routine observations from the human colonies, a request for historical pattern analysis from the Linguistic Council, maintenance schedules for the sensor arrays, nothing requiring creativity or interpretation. Nothing that couldn't be processed through established protocols. She preferred it that way. The other researchers moved through the archive's corridors like particles in suspension, paths intersecting with mathematical precision, interactions limited to necessary data exchange. Conversation, when it occurred, focused exclusively on work. Personal disclosure served no institutional purpose. Leora had shared quarters with her assigned partner for 6 years without learning anything about her beyond professional competencies and dietary requirements. That relationship had dissolved when her partner transferred to a deep observation post near human space. Leora had experienced no particular response to the departure. Connection implied vulnerability to loss. The sisterhood had evolved past such inefficiencies. Her current quarters occupied the residential ring's inner arc, smaller than the shared spaces, designed for solitary occupation. She'd requisitioned additional processing equipment to fill areas previously allocated for social interaction. The walls displayed shifting patterns of human behavioral data, updates cycling through every 8 hours. She ate meals at her workstation, slept when productivity metrics indicated optimal rest intervals, maintained her physical form through prescribed exercise protocols in the archive's communal facilities, surrounded by others engaged in identical routines, each isolated within their own biological maintenance requirements. 17 years. The number carried no emotional weight, simply a measurement of time elapsed since her final academic certifications, since she'd taken her position within the Ethnographic Council, since she'd last experienced anything resembling disruption to the archive's perfect, predictable rhythm. The proximity alarm registered peripherally, a minor data point among thousands. Leora noted it, tagged it for the tracking division, returned her attention to the linguistic analysis requiring completion before the afternoon briefing. Proximity events occurred regularly. Space debris, defunct satellites from human exploration centuries past, occasionally larger fragments from the belt's constant grinding collisions. The archive's position had been calculated to minimize such encounters while maintaining optimal observation range of the human expansion vector. Minor course corrections handled automatically. The second alarm carried different qualities. She felt it through the station's infrastructure before conscious recognition, a vibration outside normal parameters, the subtle shift in gravitational constants that indicated mass displacement. Her fingers stilled above the interface. Around her, other researchers lifted their attention from individual workstations, heads turning toward the observation windows in synchronized response to shared training. Something moved through the debris field. Not the slow tumble of asteroid fragments, but powered trajectory. Erratic corrections suggesting damaged propulsion. Leora's processing centers engaged automatically, calculating vectors, mass estimates, probability matrices. Human construction. Small transport class. Single occupant capacity. Life support systems visible through the infrared spectrum. Flickering. Inconsistent. Approaching failure thresholds. The archive's tracking systems locked onto the pod. Data streamed across every interface simultaneously. The collective intelligence of the Sisterhood engaging with the problem. Collision probability, 97%. Time to impact, 43 minutes. The pod's trajectory would carry it directly through their drift path. Standard protocol demanded evasive maneuvering. The archive possessed limited propulsion capability. Maintaining position required delicate balance, but sufficient to avoid collision with objects this size. Leora watched the pod tumble through vacuum, its surface scarred by impacts, one entire section blackened by heat or explosion. Whoever occupied that small metal shell was dying. The life support readings made that clear. Oxygen reserves depleting faster than scrubbers could recycle. Temperature fluctuations indicating failing thermal regulation. The occupant's biological signatures showed in the long-range sensors. Human physiology, elevated stress markers, consciousness fading toward hypothermic shutdown. Her hands moved across the interface, pulling detailed scans, analyzing the pod's construction, its markings, the specific damage patterns. A prospector, most likely. Independent operator working the asteroid belts for mineral deposits, valuable enough to justify the risks. Humans engaged in such activities constantly. Driven by economic incentives the Sisterhood had documented extensively without ever fully comprehending. The willingness to risk individual existence for abstract resource accumulation seemed fundamentally irrational, yet the pattern persisted across human cultures and centuries. The Council convened within minutes, physical presence unnecessary. Neural links created shared consciousness space, where decisions occurred through pure information exchange. Leora felt the collective attention focus on the approaching pod, felt the archive's institutional wisdom engage with unprecedented variables. 300 years. The number resonated through the shared consciousness. 300 years since the Accord established absolute non-interference with human subjects. The Sisterhood observed, documented, analyzed, but never touched. Never contaminated their data through direct interaction. The sanctity of pure observation formed the foundation of their entire culture, their purpose, their identity. The human would die. That outcome existed as simple fact, requiring no interpretation. The pod systems would fail completely in approximately 90 minutes. The occupant would lose consciousness within 30, expire within 2 hours. The archive could record the entire process. Document every biological marker, every neurological response, generate comprehensive data on human death through environmental exposure, valuable information. Tragic, perhaps, in human terms, but the Sisterhood didn't process tragedy, only patterns. Leora stood at the containment observation port, separated from the pod by reinforced composite and vacuum. The archive had drawn the damaged vessel into its embrace through gravitational manipulation, holding it stationary relative to the station's rotation. Through the small viewport, she could see him, a shape barely visible through condensation and failing systems, movements growing slower, more labored, human, male, approximately 30 standard years, based on visible characteristics, alone, dying. Behind her, the council chamber filled with voices transmitted through neural links, arguments constructed from precedent, from sacred methodology, from the fundamental architecture of their purpose. They were observers, witnesses. Their entire culture had been built upon the sanctity of distance, upon the purity of watching without being seen. She felt the station's atmosphere against her skin, cooler than she preferred, carrying the metallic tang of recycled filtration. Her body registered details. Her conscious mind tried to suppress, the rhythm of her own pulse accelerating, the slight tremor in her hands, the warmth gathering beneath her sternum that had no correlation with ambient temperature. 300 years of data, and nowhere in those exhaustive records had her species documented this particular response. the visceral compulsion to act against institutional foundation because inaction felt unbearable. The vote concluded through the shared consciousness. The accord would hold. The human would be allowed to expire naturally, while instruments recorded every biological fluctuation, every neurological cascade, transforming death into one final dataset. Perfect observation required perfect detachment. The council dispersed. Leora remained at the observation port, her reflection ghosting across the composite surface, overlaying the dying human's struggling form. The containment seal's authorization codes existed in her memory from maintenance training. Standard safety protocols required all council members to access emergency systems. Leora's fingers moved across the control interface with the same muscle memory precision that governed her data analysis, bypassing security layers, overriding the lockdown protocols the council had implemented. The seal broke with a sound like tearing fabric. Atmosphere equalized between the pod and the archive's medical bay, temperature differentials creating momentary turbulence. She moved through it without hesitation, her body entering the pod's cramped interior, where the human lay strapped into the pilot's seat, his chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular patterns. His skin felt wrong against her touch, too warm despite the thermal readings, textured differently than theoretical models suggested, yielding beneath her fingers as she disconnected failing equipment. The direct physical contact generated sensory data her nervous system had no context for processing. Heat, texture, the faint vibration of pulse beneath skin. She'd touched human tissue before, preserved samples, genetic material, archaeological remains, but never living flesh, never a body maintaining its own temperature, its own rhythm independent of external support. She worked through protocols designed for her species' physiology, adapting concentrations, modifying atmospheric composition. His breathing changed under her hands, the ragged pull gradually smoothing into something approaching stability. She monitored his vital signs through the archive's medical sensors, watching the dangerous fluctuations settle toward sustainable ranges. Her own physiology responded with reactions she couldn't categorize. The acceleration of her pulse, the warmth spreading through her core, the hyper-awareness of every point where her body contacted his. When his eyes opened, focus swimming through sedation and oxygen deprivation, he looked directly at her, not through observation glass. Not mediated by sensors or translated into data streams, the directness felt like physical impact, his gaze tracking across her features, registering confusion, recognition of difference, something else she couldn't categorize. Her chest tightened. She felt exposed in ways the archive's environmental suits never addressed. He tried to speak. His vocal cords produced sounds without coherent structure, biology not yet recovered enough for language. She placed her hand against his chest, ostensibly to monitor respiratory function, but the contact felt like something else entirely. His heartbeat pulsed against her palm, strong and irregular, fighting through trauma toward recovery. The rhythm imprinted itself across her awareness, with disproportionate significance. The medical bay's sensors transmitted everything to the council's review systems. She knew they were watching, analyzing, documenting her violation in the same clinical detail they applied to all observations. By the time the human's condition stabilized, her fate had already been determined through collective deliberation. She'd broken the accord, contaminated 3 centuries of methodological purity, introduced variables that would corrupt every subsequent observation. The summons arrived through her neural link before she'd finished basic physiological assessment. She left the human sleeping under medical supervision, his systems finally maintaining homeostasis without her constant intervention, and presented herself to the council's physical chamber. They didn't speak immediately. The silence held weight, institutional judgment crystallizing in the space between bodies. Leora stood in the chamber's center, surrounded by her colleagues and superiors, feeling their collective attention like atmospheric pressure. She'd known these individuals for years, worked alongside them, shared data and analysis, and the archive's perfect isolation. None of that history registered in their expressions now. They regarded her with the same clinical detachment they applied to all subjects under observation. The eldest spoke first, her voice carrying the archive's full authority. "You violated the accord." Leora didn't deny it. The action existed as documented fact, recorded from multiple sensor perspectives. Yes. 300 years of uncontaminated observation ended through one individual's impulse. The characterization as impulse struck her as incomplete, but she lacked alternative explanation. She'd acted without deliberation, without processing the decision through proper analytical frameworks. Her body had moved before her conscious mind engaged. Impulse seemed as accurate a description as any. "The human would have died," she said, then stopped, uncertain why that statement felt like justification. Humans died constantly. The archive documented mortality across all their colonies: accidents, disease, violence, age. Death represented inevitable biological endpoint. Its prevention served no institutional purpose. Yes, the eldest agreed. Natural expiration while under observation. Unprecedented data opportunity. Leora had no response. The logic held perfect internal consistency. Her action had sacrificed valuable research for what? She couldn't articulate the motivation even to herself. Something beneath language, beneath the analytical frameworks that structured her consciousness. A response that felt fundamental, despite serving no rational purpose. The council deliberated. She felt their collective consciousness engage with the problem of her existence, calculating consequences, weighing institutional needs against individual violation. Exile would waste her decades of expertise. Termination seemed excessive for preserving a single human specimen. The compromise emerged through long consideration, each member contributing analytical perspective, until consensus crystallized. She would maintain the human, study him, extract behavioral data sufficient to justify the contamination she'd introduced. The archive would gain unprecedented access to human cognition through direct interaction, and she would bear sole responsibility for managing all variables such proximity inevitably created. The eldest's expression remained neutral, but Leora detected subtle markers of curiosity beneath professional detachment. Perhaps useful data emerges from this violation: direct human observation at close range, behavioral analysis without technological mediation. The Council authorizes this experimental protocol. Your assignment: maintain the specimen, document all interactions, provide comprehensive reports on human psychology through sustained proximity. They gave her quarters in the residential ring, larger spaces than her previous solitary allocation, designed historically for paired researchers, though such arrangements had grown rare over recent generations. The rooms felt vast and empty when she first entered, atmosphere untouched by occupation for years, surfaces clean and sterile. Kyle arrived hours later, transported from medical under sedation, his body still recovering from near death. The archive's maintenance personnel installed him in the secondary sleeping chamber with clinical efficiency, establishing monitoring equipment, verifying atmospheric compatibility, departing without comment. Leora stood in the common area, watching through the open doorway as they arranged his unconscious form on the sleeping platform, adjusting support systems, connecting sensors to the archive's central intelligence. Then they left, and she was alone with him, with the human, with the variable that had destroyed her carefully maintained equilibrium. Kyle woke slowly, consciousness surfacing through layers of medication and trauma. Leora monitored his emergence through the archive's sensors, watching neural activity increase, vital signs strengthen, motor function return to voluntary control. She remained in the common area, maintaining distance, uncertain what protocol governed this unprecedented situation. The archive's entire methodology presumed observation without interaction. No framework existed for cohabitation. When he finally appeared in the doorway, he moved carefully, testing his recovered strength against simple actions. His eyes found her immediately, that same direct gaze she remembered from the medical bay. Recognition flickered across his features, not of her specifically, but of the moment they'd shared, the contact, the intervention that had pulled him from dying into living. "You saved me," he said. His voice carried roughness from disuse, but the words themselves emerged clearly. Linguistic structure intact despite trauma. "The others wanted me dead, for their research." Leora processed the characterization. Inaccurate in intent, but functionally correct in outcome. The Council prioritized observational purity over individual preservation. I acted outside protocol. He studied her, attention moving across her features with the same intensity he'd demonstrated while unconscious. She felt the examination physically, awareness cascading through her nervous system in response to his focus. Her species possessed more sophisticated sensory capabilities than humans, broader visual spectrum, enhanced pattern recognition, superior information processing. But his gaze carried qualities she couldn't pass through technical frameworks. Interest, assessment, something that made her skin feel warmer despite unchanged environmental temperature. Why? He asked. The question she'd been avoiding. The eldest had asked implicitly through procedural language, institutional frameworks. Kyle asked directly, simply, requiring answer, without offering refuge in bureaucratic complexity. I don't know, she admitted. The confession felt dangerous. The sisterhood operated through absolute certainty, complete knowledge, comprehensive understanding. Uncertainty marked failure. But nothing in her training prepared her for the experience of watching him die while possessing capability to prevent it. He nodded slowly, as if her ignorance satisfied some requirement. I'm Kyle, he offered, independent prospector, or I was, before the accident. His attention shifted around the quarters, taking in the archive's alien architecture, the data displays covering the walls, the observation equipment monitoring their interaction. What happens now? Cohabitation, Leora said. Under observation. The Council has assigned me to maintain your presence and document behavioral patterns. You represent the first human subject under direct study in archive history. She watched him process that information, saw the moment comprehension crystallized. His jaw tightened fractionally. His hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, curled into loose fists. I'm your research project. Functionally, yes. And if I refuse, ask you to send me back to human space. Leora hadn't considered that possibility. The logistics alone seemed prohibitive. The archive maintained no transport capability for biological cargo, no diplomatic channels with human authorities, no protocols for voluntary subject release. But beyond practical constraints existed deeper truth. She'd violated the accord to preserve his existence. The thought of reversing that choice, of allowing him to leave, generated response patterns that made no rational sense. We would need council approval, she said carefully. The political complications would be significant. Political? He laughed, the sound carrying bitterness. I nearly died alone in vacuum, wake up as an alien science experiment, and you're worried about politics. The characterization stung, though she couldn't articulate why. She'd stated simple facts. The institutional complications existed as objective reality, but his tone suggested she'd failed some test, some human expectation she didn't possess framework to recognize. I should have let you die, she said. The words emerged without conscious decision, surprise even to herself. The council was correct. I contaminated methodology, violated foundational principles, for no rational purpose. His expression shifted. The hardness in his features softened fractionally. He moved closer, not threatening but deliberate, crossing the space between them until only a few feet separated their bodies. This close, she registered details the sensors couldn't capture. The specific way his chest expanded with breathing, the faint scent of human biology mixing with the archive's sterile atmosphere, the warmth radiating from his skin. But you didn't, he said quietly. Let me die. You broke your rules. Pissed off your people. Why? That question again. The unanswerable core. She met his gaze, felt the weight of his attention, experienced the profound strangeness of being seen without technological mediation. Something felt wrong, about watching, about doing nothing while possessing capability to act. Conscience, Kyle said. Guilt, empathy. Pick your human psychological term. The sisterhood doesn't experience such responses. We observe without emotional contamination. Then what do you call what you felt when you opened that seal? She had no answer. The sensation remained categorically distinct from anything in her training, her experience, her species' documented psychological range. An aberration, a malfunction, or something her culture had systematically eliminated over 3 centuries of selective breeding and institutional conditioning. The silence between them held weight. Kale finally stepped back, his attention shifting to the quarters they now shared. "Show me how this works," he said, "this cohabitation, because I don't know your protocols and you don't seem to know mine." Relief flooded through her at the practical focus. Logistics she could manage, analysis she understood. She began explaining the quarter's layout, the atmospheric controls, the archive's basic infrastructure. He listened, asked clarifying questions, adapted to alien systems with competence that suggested experience in unfamiliar environments, a prospector's skill set, survival across hostile contexts, rapid acclimatization, improvisation under constraint. They established preliminary boundaries, separate sleeping chambers, though the archive's monitoring systems observed both spaces equally, shared common areas for work and necessary interaction, scheduled intervals for solitary retreat. Meal preparation in the compact galley, though their nutritional requirements diverged significantly, his metabolism demanding proteins and complex carbohydrates, hers requiring mineral supplements and specialized compounds the archive synthesized. The rituals developed gradually, emerging from necessity rather than design. Morning cycles when they both occupied the common area, him preparing his first meal while she reviewed overnight data. The careful navigation of the galley's limited space, bodies shifting to accommodate each other's movements. Evening periods when exhaustion drove them both toward rest, but neither wanted to be first to retreat. She found herself tracking his patterns, the way he ran his hand through his hair when frustrated, the specific quality of silence that indicated concentration versus withdrawal, the subtle shifts in posture that preceded speech. Data collection, she told herself. Professional observation. But the information felt personal in ways her training never addressed, accumulating significance beyond institutional requirements. Kyle adapted to the archive's rhythm faster than she'd anticipated. He requested access to technical systems, demonstrated capability with repairs and maintenance that made him valuable beyond his status as research subject. The archive's aging infrastructure benefited from his attention. She'd submit requests to maintenance division, and he'd complete the work before official responses arrived, his hands confident with tools and systems, making functional what had been broken. She watched him work, ostensibly to document his behavioral patterns, but found herself focused on details irrelevant to research. The flex of his shoulders when he reached into tight spaces, the precision of his fingers manipulating delicate components, the way concentration softened the tension he carried in his jaw. The archive's sensors captured everything, but her private awareness catalogued dimensions they couldn't measure. The specific quality of his presence, the way the quarters felt different when he occupied them, the gradual erosion of the careful distance she'd maintained throughout her entire adult life. 3 weeks passed. The council demanded preliminary reports. She compiled data, documented interaction patterns, described human behavioral characteristics under sustained observation. But the reports felt incomplete, edited, failing to capture textures that existed beyond quantifiable measurement. How could she document the way her pulse accelerated when he entered rooms? The progressive decrease in personal space they both tolerated, the growing anticipation she felt during intervals when he was absent. The archive watched everything. She felt the institutional gaze as physical presence, transforming every moment into performance, intimacy converted to data. But beneath the surveillance, something else developed. Recognition of another consciousness sharing her space, disrupting equilibrium she'd maintained for 17 years, forcing awareness of dimensions she'd successfully suppressed. Kyle never asked again about leaving. She never offered. They existed in careful suspension, neither acknowledging the impossibility of their situation nor imagining alternatives. The present consumed all available attention, learning each other's rhythms, negotiating shared existence, feeling the boundaries between them erode with each passing day. The maintenance failure occurred during third shift, when the archive's skeleton crew operated at minimal capacity. Leora woke to proximity alarms, power fluctuations visible through the quarter's observation windows as emergency lighting cycled through backup systems. She rose immediately, professional training overriding sleep inertia, and found Kale already awake in the common area, his attention focused on a diagnostic panel he'd installed to monitor the archive's systems. Main power coupling failed in Section 7, he said without preamble. If it cascades to the environmental processes, we'll lose atmospheric integrity in the residential ring. She processed the information, calculating response protocols. Maintenance division will require 40 minutes to reach the affected systems. Too long. Secondary failures will propagate. He was already moving toward the door, gathering tools from the repair kit he'd accumulated. I can reach the coupling through the maintenance shaft in 20 minutes, bypass the damaged components, reroute power through the backup grid. Protocol demanded she contact central operations, coordinate through official channels, defer to assigned personnel. But she'd observed Kyle's technical competence over weeks of cohabitation. She trusted his assessment more than bureaucratic response time. "I'll assist," she said. They moved through the archive's corridors together, the emergency lighting casting strange shadows across familiar architecture. The maintenance shaft accessed through a service panel near their residential section, narrow passages designed for equipment access, not comfortable navigation. Kyle entered first, his human frame smaller than her species average, able to maneuver through tight spaces with more facility. Leora followed, feeling the shaft's walls press against her shoulders, the temperature several degrees cooler than regulated living areas. Kyle moved ahead, his form visible only as shifting darkness against the shaft's dim emergency illumination. She focused on his movements, matching his pace, navigating by sound when sight proved inadequate. The power fluctuations intensified. Lights flickered, died, returned in irregular patterns. In one extended period of darkness, she felt rather than saw Kyle stop ahead. Her momentum carried her forward, body colliding with his in the confined space. The contact registered as comprehensive sensory data, the heat of his back against her chest, the solid mass of him, the sudden awareness of breathing synchronized in the darkness. "Sorry," she said, though neither had control over the collision. "It's fine." His voice carried differently in the enclosed space, intimate despite normal volume. "Power junction's just ahead. I need to access the panel." They continued in darkness, navigating by touch and spatial memory. When they reached the junction, Kyle activated a small work light, illuminating the damaged coupling in harsh white brilliance. The components showed clear signs of material fatigue, connections corroded by time and insufficient maintenance. He worked with focused intensity, hands moving through repair sequences with practiced confidence. Leora held the light, providing illumination and occasionally retrieving tools from the kit. The shaft's confined dimensions meant constant proximity, shoulders touching, her hand brushing his arm when exchanging equipment, the particular awareness of another body occupying space designed for solitary navigation. "Hold this steady," Kyle said, guiding her hand toward a component bundle that needed securing while he reconnected the power feeds. Her fingers wrapped around the indicated section, feeling the vibration of active current through insulated casing. His hands worked around hers, close enough that she felt the heat of his skin, the specific texture of his palms when they made inadvertent contact. The repair required 30 minutes of sustained concentration. They didn't speak beyond necessary technical communication, but the silence felt charged with dimensions, beyond efficient collaboration. She became hyper-aware of physical details, the sound of his breathing in the enclosed space, the way sweat gathered at his temples from exertion, the particular quality of focus that tightened his features when working through complex problems. When power finally restored, the sudden brilliance of normal lighting felt intrusive. They remained motionless for several seconds, blinking through adaptation, still pressed together in the maintenance shaft's confines. Kyle's shoulder rested against her chest. Her hand remained on the component bundle, his fingers still positioned around hers from the final connection sequence. He looked back at her, the movement bringing their faces close in the narrow space. His eyes reflected the restored lighting, and she saw her own features mirrored in his gaze. The moment extended, neither moving, breathing the same recycled air, consciousness of contact, overwhelming all other awareness. Kyle withdrew first, creating distance as he gathered tools, preparing to navigate back through the shaft. The separation felt like physical loss, though Leora couldn't identify what exactly had been removed. They returned to the quarters in silence, professional detachment reasserting itself through familiar corridors and regulated lighting. But something had shifted. When they stood together in the common area, power fully restored, emergency concluded, the space between them felt different, charged with awareness that hadn't existed before, or that she'd successfully ignored until physical proximity made denial impossible. "Thank you," Kyle said. "For helping, you didn't have to." "Efficient resource allocation," she responded automatically, retreating to institutional language. "Your technical competence exceeds maintenance division response time." His expression suggested recognition of the deflection. "Is that what this is? Efficient resource allocation?" The question hung between them. She knew what he was really asking, whether she'd helped because of professional calculation or because of something else, something neither of them had language to articulate within the archive's observational framework. "I don't know," she admitted. The truth she kept returning to, the uncertainty that violated everything she'd been trained to be. Kyle nodded slowly. He didn't push further. Instead, he moved toward his sleeping chamber, pausing at the threshold. "I'm glad you were there. In the shaft. Working together felt..." He trailed off, searching for words. "Different. Better than doing it alone." He disappeared into his chamber before she could respond. Leora remained in the common area, feeling the ghost of contact where his body had pressed against hers, where their hands had touched through necessary collaboration. The archive's sensors had recorded everything, every moment of proximity, every physiological response, every departure from professional detachment. She wondered what patterns they detected, what analysis they generated from data that felt, to her, beyond quantification. The warmth still spreading through her core had no correlation with ambient temperature. The acceleration of her pulse served no survival function. The particular quality of awareness that made her conscious of his presence, even through closed doors, existed outside any research framework she'd been trained to apply. Something had changed in that dark, confined space. Some boundary had eroded that she didn't know how to rebuild. And standing alone in quarters they shared, feeling the residual heat of contact, Leora understood that observation could no longer maintain the distance it required. She'd become participant, contaminated variable, someone experiencing rather than documenting. The realization should have generated professional concern. Instead, it felt like relief. The Council's review arrived 3 days after the maintenance incident. Leora accessed the report through her neural link, feeling the collective consciousness engage with her documented observations, analyzing patterns, extracting insights about human behavior under sustained proximity. They noted the increased frequency of physical contact, the progressive erosion of personal space boundaries, the correlation between collaborative tasks and elevated physiological markers in both subjects. The eldest's private message carried different tone than official reports. Fascinating data. Continue current protocols. The human's integration exceeds projections. Your emotional contamination, while methodologically problematic, generates unprecedented observational opportunities. Emotional contamination. The phrase resonated through Leora's consciousness long after she closed the link. The sisterhood had identified what she couldn't articulate: the progressive failure of detachment, the development of responses that served no institutional purpose. But rather than terminating the experiment, they'd authorized continuation. Her violation had become valuable. Her compromised objectivity transformed into research tool. The knowledge should have provided clarity. Instead, it deepened the dissonance between her internal experience and institutional role. Every interaction with Kale now carried dual awareness, the genuine response emerging from proximity and shared existence, and the understanding that such responses constituted data, observations, feeding the archive's comprehensive analysis of human sisterhood interface dynamics. Kyle noticed her distraction during their morning routine. He'd developed sensitivity to her moods, reading subtleties she hadn't realized she projected. "Council trouble?" he asked, preparing his breakfast at the galley counter while she reviewed data at the common area workstation. "Evaluation of our cohabitation patterns," she said carefully. "Analysis of interaction frequency, spatial proximity trends, collaborative behavior metrics. How we're doing as roommates translated into science speak." The characterization wasn't entirely inaccurate. She allowed faint acknowledgement. Not quite a smile, but relaxation of features that he'd learned to recognize as agreement. "And what's the verdict?" He moved to the seating area, breakfast prepared, settling into the chair he'd claimed as his preferred position. "Are we properly scientific?" The data suggests successful adaptation, integration exceeding baseline projections. What does that mean for us, practically? Us. The pronoun suggested unit formation, shared identity beyond individual existence. Leora processed the implication, uncertain whether to correct the assumption or acknowledge the accuracy. They did function as unit now, coordinating schedules, sharing resources, maintaining the quarter's environment through collaborative effort. Boundaries that had seemed absolute when he first arrived had eroded to permeable membranes, easily crossed through necessity or comfort. Continued cohabitation under current parameters, she said. The Council has authorized extended observation. Kale's expression shifted through several configurations before settling on something that looked like resignation. So I'm staying. Long term. Unless you request alternative arrangements. He studied her. That direct gaze she'd grown accustomed to, but never entirely comfortable with. Would you prefer alternative arrangements? The question caught her unprepared. Professional distance demanded neutral response. Preferences were irrelevant to institutional requirements. But she found herself considering honestly, examining her reactions to the thought of returning to solitary quarters, to days structured around isolated work and regulated rest cycles. No, she admitted, the current situation feels acceptable. Acceptable. He smiled, the expression carrying warmth that generated response in her chest cavity. High praise from someone who studies efficiency metrics. I didn't mean, I know what you meant. He returned attention to his breakfast, but the smile persisted. I feel the same. Acceptable. Better than I expected, actually. You're decent company for an alien researcher studying my every move. The casual acceptance disturbed something in her carefully maintained frameworks. He knew about the surveillance, understood their every interaction fed institutional analysis. Yet he'd adapted, learned to exist under constant observation without apparent psychological deterioration. She wondered whether prospector work had prepared him for such conditions. Extended isolation, punctuated by corporate monitoring, life reduced to productivity metrics and safety compliance. The days developed rhythm, morning routines where they occupied the same spaces with increasing comfort, boundaries negotiated through habit rather than deliberate protocol. Kale would prepare breakfast while she reviewed overnight data, their movements coordinated through learned patterns. Him reaching past her toward storage compartments, her shifting to accommodate his trajectory, the casual contacts that no longer generated acute awareness because they'd become baseline normal. Afternoons meant work. Kale had assumed unofficial responsibility for the archive's maintenance needs, identifying problems before official monitoring detected them, implementing repairs that extended aging systems' functional lifetime. Leora observed when possible, documenting his technical processes while recognizing that observation had become excuse for proximity. She enjoyed watching him work, the focused concentration, the competent manipulation of tools, the particular satisfaction he radiated when solving complex problems. Evening periods carried different qualities. They'd begun sharing meals when schedules aligned, Kyle adapting human recipes to ingredients available through the archive's synthesizers, while Leora maintained her species' nutritional requirements. Conversation emerged naturally during these shared times, him describing life as independent prospector, the risks and rewards of solitary work, the vast distances between human settlements that made isolation fundamental to existence. She offered glimpses of the archive's culture, the sisterhood's methodological principles, the 3-century evolution that had refined observation into sacred practice. He asked questions constantly, not intrusive but genuinely curious. What motivated her species' withdrawal from direct contact? How did the sisterhood maintain cultural cohesion across such emotional distance? Did she ever feel lonely before he arrived? That last question struck deeper than others. Leora considered it seriously, examining 17 years of solitary existence with new awareness. I didn't recognize it as loneliness, she said finally. The absence seemed normal, expected. I had no framework for identifying what was missing. And now? Now she understood absence through contrast. The quarters felt empty when he worked in other sections. Sleep cycles seemed longer when she couldn't hear his breathing through the wall separating their chambers. Morning routines lacked something essential during intervals when his schedule diverged from hers. Now I recognize the difference, she admitted. Between solitude and isolation. His hand found hers across the small table, fingers wrapping around her wrist in gesture that had become familiar through the maintenance shaft incident and subsequent collaborations. The contact generated warmth disproportionate to physical parameters. His skin against hers, pulse points aligned, the specific weight of his attention focused completely on her. "I'm glad I'm here," Cale said quietly. "Despite the circumstances, despite being your research subject, I'm glad we're experiencing this together." She should withdraw, maintain professional distance, remind him of institutional boundaries and observational protocols. Instead, she turned her hand in his grip, allowing their palms to press together, fingers interweaving in deliberate contact that served no functional purpose beyond the simple human, and apparently not exclusively human, need for connection. The archive watched. Sensors documented the moment with comprehensive precision, capturing physiological markers, analyzing chemical responses, generating data that would feed council analysis. Somewhere in the collective consciousness, her colleagues observed this interaction, categorizing it within frameworks of cross-species behavioral study. But sitting there, hand joined with his, feeling the particular warmth of his skin and the steady rhythm of his pulse, Leora found she couldn't maintain concern about institutional observation. The moment felt private despite surveillance, real despite being documented. Theirs, even as it became everyone's data. The nights changed first. Leora found herself wakeful during rest cycles, her consciousness refusing the release into sleep that had always come easily. Through the wall separating their chambers, she heard Cale's breathing, sometimes steady with sleep, sometimes irregular with his own wakefulness. The thin barrier felt simultaneously substantial and negligible, maintaining separation while broadcasting intimate evidence of his presence. On the seventh night of disrupted sleep, she rose from her sleeping platform and moved through the common area. Dim emergency lighting cast the familiar space in unfamiliar shadows. She'd activated the galley's beverage synthesizer when Cale emerged from his chamber, moving with the careful quietness of someone trying not to disturb others, despite their obvious awareness. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, his voice carrying the roughness of near-sleep vocalization. "Irregular rest patterns, unusual for my physiology." He approached the galley, requesting his own beverage, settling into position beside her at the counter. Close enough that she felt his warmth, registered the particular scent of human biology after hours of sleep. Not unpleasant, simply different, uniquely identifiable as his. "I keep thinking," he said, attention focused on the synthesizer's output rather than her directly, about the pod, about dying alone in vacuum. How quiet it was. How cold. She'd read his medical reports, seen the psychological assessments noting trauma response within normal parameters. But hearing him speak about the experience felt different than clinical documentation. Personal, vulnerable in ways data never captured. "Then you appeared," he continued. "Your face through the condensation. Your hands on me. First real human contact I'd had in months, except you're not human." He smiled without humor. "Everything after that moment feels borrowed, extra. Time I shouldn't have had." "Survivor guilt," Leora identified. "Common psychological response to near-death experience. Is that what you experience? When you think about breaking your accord to save me?" The question landed with precision. She did think about it. The moment of decision, the compulsion that overrode institutional training, the ongoing consequences that had restructured her entire existence. Did she experience guilt? Regret? The characterizations felt incomplete for the complex mixture of responses the memory generated. "I experience uncertainty," she said carefully, "about whether I acted correctly by your standards or mine, whether the outcome justifies the method, whether I'd make the same choice again, knowing all subsequent complications." "Would you?" He turned toward her now, bringing their faces close in the dim lighting. "If you could go back, knowing it would cost you everything you'd built in the archive, would you still open that seal? 17 years of perfect institutional integration, methodological purity, career advancement tracking toward eventual council leadership, all of it compromised through single impulsive action. She'd sacrificed everything she'd been for, what? To preserve one human's existence? To experience these strange weeks of shared quarters and eroding boundaries? Yes, she admitted. The word emerged with certainty that surprised her. I would make the same choice. His hand found hers on the counter, fingers threading between hers with familiarity that felt simultaneously new and ancient. Why? Because watching you die felt unbearable. Because inaction violated something fundamental that I didn't know existed within me. Because she stopped, uncertain how to articulate feelings that existed beyond language, beyond analysis, beyond everything her training had equipped her to process. Because you're not just an observer anymore, Kyle finished. You're a person, with responses and connections and the messy inability to maintain perfect detachment. The characterization felt accurate. The sisterhood had refined observation through cultural evolution, systematically eliminating personal response that contaminated data integrity. But she'd never been entirely successful at that elimination. Some part of her had always resisted, preserved capacity for reaction that served no institutional purpose. Opening the seal hadn't created that capacity. It had simply revealed what she'd been suppressing for 17 years. The archive considers it contamination, she said. Emotional interference with objective analysis. And what do you consider it? She looked at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of contact, the specific texture of his skin, the gentle pressure of his fingers against hers. Being alive, she said quietly, rather than just existing. The silence that followed carried weight. Kyle's thumb moved across the back of her hand in small, repetitive motion, soothing or nervous, she couldn't determine. His attention remained focused on their contact point, as if the simple joining of hands required concentrated observation. I'm scared, he admitted finally, of what happens when the council decides this experiment is complete, whether they send me away, whether you go back to being perfect observer. Whether any of this, he gestured vaguely at their joined hands, the shared space, the intimacy they'd developed, means anything beyond research data. Leora felt his fear resonate through her own consciousness. She'd avoided considering long-term implications, living instead within the immediate present of their cohabitation. But eventually the council would conclude their analysis. Eventually, institutional requirements would reassert priority over personal preference. Eventually, she'd have to choose between the archive's 3-century methodology and whatever this was becoming. I don't have answers, she said, only uncertainty, and the knowledge that I don't want this to end. His fingers tightened around hers. Neither do I. They remained at the counter until exhaustion finally permitted sleep, hands joined in the darkness, breathing gradually synchronizing, proximity no longer maintained through necessity, but through deliberate choice. The archive watched, documenting everything. Somewhere in the collective consciousness analysis occurred, patterns extracted, conclusions drawn about human sisterhood emotional bonding under sustained proximity. But sitting there with him, feeling his warmth and his fear and his hope bleeding into her awareness, Leora discovered she no longer cared about institutional observation. The moment existed for them. Whatever happened next, this truth remained. They'd found something together that transcended research parameters, something genuine, something worth the cost of everything she'd sacrificed. The summons arrived during morning cycle, bypassing normal communication channels to appear directly in Leora's neural consciousness. Immediate council presence required, no delay permitted. She disconnected from the link with physical symptoms, accelerated pulse, elevated temperature, the specific tension that gathered in her chest when confronting institutional authority. Kyle noticed immediately. He'd been preparing breakfast, but his attention shifted completely to her, reading distress in postures she didn't realize she projected. What happened? Council summons. Immediate presence required. His jaw tightened. About us. She didn't correct the pronoun. Whatever they'd become, the council's attention would focus on both of them, the contaminated observer and the human specimen generating unprecedented complications. The council chamber felt different this time. The collective consciousness carried qualities she couldn't pass through normal frameworks: anticipation, concern, something approaching judgment. The eldest occupied her traditional position, but surrounding her sat representatives from divisions Leora rarely interacted with. cultural preservation, institutional ethics, long-range planning. The assembly suggested consequences beyond simple protocol review. Researcher Leora, the eldest began, her tone carrying formal weight, your cohabitation experiment has generated significant data. The Council has reviewed comprehensive analysis of all documented interactions. Leora maintained neutral posture, awaiting the verdict she couldn't predict. Her violation of the Accord had been authorized as research opportunity, but authorization could be revoked if outcomes failed to justify methodology. The patterns are concerning, another council member stated, representative from cultural preservation, her expression communicating disapproval, progressive boundary erosion, emotional attachment formation, behavioral modifications inconsistent with pure observation. You've developed what humans term personal relationship with the subject. The accusation hung in shared consciousness. Leora didn't deny it. The evidence existed in comprehensive documentation. Every conversation, every shared meal, every moment of hand-holding and proximity-seeking. The archive had recorded her transformation from observer to participant with clinical precision. The question, the eldest continued, is whether such contamination serves institutional purposes, whether insights gained justify methodological compromise, whether your unique perspective generates value that compensates for loss of objectivity. Leora understood the calculation occurring beneath formal language. They were determining her utility, whether she remained asset or liability, whether the experiment should continue or be terminated with all attendant consequences. The data is unprecedented, offered the representative from long-range planning. Direct observation of human emotional bonding, comprehensive documentation of cross-species attachment formation, behavioral patterns never previously recorded. If we can extract reliable insights from this contaminated observation, the archive's understanding of human psychology advances significantly. At what cost? Cultural preservation challenged. We've maintained methodological purity for 3 centuries. One researcher's inability to maintain detachment doesn't justify abandoning foundational principles. The debate continued around her, through her, the collective consciousness engaging with her existence as abstract problem requiring solution. She felt reduced to variable again, not person experiencing genuine connection, but data point generating controversy. The profound irony struck her. The council analyzed her emotional responses with the same clinical detachment she'd once applied to human subjects, perfect observation requiring perfect dehumanization, whether the subject was human or not. What does the researcher herself conclude? The eldest question cut through competing perspectives. Leora, you've experienced something no member of the sisterhood has encountered in recorded history. Direct, sustained, emotionally engaged interaction with human subject. What insights can you provide that justify the contamination you've introduced? The weight of collective attention focused completely on her consciousness. This was the moment, the opportunity to translate private experience into institutional value, to demonstrate that her violation had generated data worth the cost. She could feel Cale's presence even through the distance separating them, remembered the weight of his hand in hers, the specific warmth of his attention, the gradual erosion of walls she'd maintained for 17 years. I understand now what observation costs, she said slowly, choosing words with precision. The archive has optimized for data purity by eliminating the observer's humanity. We've documented every aspect of human behavior while systematically preventing ourselves from experiencing the conditions that generate such behavior. We study love without loving, analyze grief without loss, map attachment while refusing all bonds. We've become perfect witnesses to life we refuse to live. The silence that followed carried qualities she couldn't name. She'd violated more than the Accord with that statement. She'd challenged the archive's foundational purpose, questioned the methodology that structured their entire culture. You're advocating for abandoning objectivity, cultural preservation stated, the accusation clear. I'm suggesting we've mistaken isolation for objectivity. That distance doesn't guarantee accuracy. It guarantees incomplete understanding. I've learned more about human emotional complexity through 6 weeks of cohabitation than 17 years of remote observation taught me. Not because the data is better, but because I finally possess context to interpret it correctly. Personal experience is not replicable, the representative argued. Individual response cannot generate universal insights, but it can generate better questions, more accurate hypotheses. Recognition of patterns we've been misinterpreting through pure distance. Human connection isn't just behavior to document, it's fundamental to their psychology in ways our remote observation can never fully comprehend. The eldest leaned forward, her attention sharpening. You're proposing systematic contamination, embedding researchers within human populations, abandoning the accord entirely. I'm proposing we acknowledge that perfect observation is impossible when the act of observing requires remaining fundamentally ignorant of what we're observing, that we've been studying human psychology while lacking the basic experiences, connection, vulnerability, emotional attachment, that make human psychology comprehensible. The debate intensified. Some council members resonated with her argument, recognizing limitations in current methodology. Others rejected the entire premise, defending institutional principles against individual contamination. Leora felt the collective consciousness fragment into competing positions, consensus eroding into genuine disagreement. Finally, the eldest spoke with authority that silenced other voices. The council cannot reach consensus on this matter, therefore we defer to experimental protocols. Researcher Leora will continue cohabitation with the human specimen under current parameters. She will document both observational data and subjective experience. In 6 months, we will review comprehensive analysis and determine whether this methodology generates insight sufficient to justify its contamination. The experiment continues. Relief flooded through Leora's consciousness, mixed with awareness of provisional victory. 6 months. Not permanent authorization, but continued existence within the impossible situation she'd created. Time to prove that her violation had value. Time to experience whatever this was becoming with Kale, without immediate termination. However, the eldest continued, we remind the researcher that she remains observer, regardless of personal compromise. The human specimen cannot be informed of his status as research subject beyond general awareness already established. Emotional attachment must not interfere with data integrity. The experiment continues, but the accord spirit must be preserved even as its letter has been violated. The mandate was clear. She could continue living with Kale, developing whatever connection existed between them, but couldn't fully acknowledge the institutional framework that made such connection possible. She must maintain the fiction of authentic relationship while understanding it existed primarily as research opportunity, genuine emotion under performative constraint, intimacy under surveillance, connection shadowed by inevitable analysis. She accepted the terms because no alternative existed. The council dispersed. She returned to quarters that suddenly felt more precious and more fragile. 6 months of borrowed time before institutional requirements reasserted themselves. 6 months to prove her contamination had value. 6 months to experience being alive before potentially returning to perfect isolation. Kale waited in the common area, his tension visible in rigid posture and clenched hands. When she entered, he stood immediately, searching her expression for outcomes words couldn't convey. We continue, she said simply. 6 months, then reassessment. His relief manifested physically, shoulders relaxing, breath releasing, hands unclenching. He crossed the space between them without hesitation, pulling her into embrace that felt simultaneously foreign and necessary. Her species didn't engage in such full-body contact casually, but she found herself accepting it, her arms wrapping around him in response, feeling his warmth and solidity and the particular way his chest expanded with breathing. 6 months, he repeated against her shoulder. Better than nothing, better than ending now. She held him, allowing the contact to continue beyond initial impulse, feeling the specific comfort generated by proximity and pressure and shared warmth. The archive watched. Sensors documented everything. But standing there in his embrace, feeling genuinely grateful for provisional reprieve, Leora understood that she'd crossed thresholds that couldn't be reversed. She was contaminated, compromised, incapable of returning to perfect observation. And she wouldn't choose differently, even knowing the cost. The 6-month deadline changed everything and nothing. Days still followed familiar patterns. Morning routines, collaborative work, shared evenings, but awareness of temporal limitation infused every moment with additional weight. Kyle commented on it during their third week of countdown, his attention focused on repair work while she observed from her usual position. "Feels different," he said, not looking up from the circuit board demanding his attention. "Knowing there's an end date makes every day feel more significant." Leora understood what he meant without requiring elaboration. Scarcity generated value. The knowledge that their current arrangement existed on borrowed time transformed ordinary moments into events demanding conscious appreciation. She found herself noticing details she'd previously processed automatically, the specific quality of his concentration, the precise way his hands manipulated tools, the particular rhythm of his breathing during focused work. "I find myself cataloging," she admitted, "not for research purposes, for personal retention, as if conscious attention can preserve what observation protocols will eventually analyze into irrelevance." He glanced up, expression softening in the way she'd learned indicated empathy. "You're creating memories, that's allowed even for perfect observers." "I'm not perfect anymore." "No," he agreed. "You're better. You're real." The characterization struck something fundamental. The sisterhood had optimized for perfection through systematic elimination of anything that introduced variation. Perfect observation, perfect detachment, perfect replicability. But perfection required removing everything that made experience meaningful. The subjective responses, the emotional resonance, the particular quality of connection that existed between specific individuals rather than generalized categories. She'd traded perfection for reality. The exchange felt worth every consequence. The physical contact between them increased through incremental progression. Casual touches had become baseline, his hand on her shoulder when passing behind her, her fingers brushing his arm when requesting his attention, the habitual ways their bodies oriented toward each other during conversation. But new forms emerged as deadline awareness intensified. Kyle initiated most advances, though Leora found herself responding without hesitation. His hand finding hers during evening conversations, the way he'd guide her positioning when showing her technical procedures, his body close behind hers, hands covering hers on tools or components. The gradual decrease in distance when sitting together, until shoulders touched naturally and neither felt compelled to create separation. She'd started spending time in his sleeping chamber during evening hours. Not sleeping there. That boundary remained intact, but sitting on the platform's edge while they talked, her presence in his private space feeling simultaneously transgressive and necessary. The first time he'd invited her, she'd hesitated at the threshold, aware of symbolic significance. Crossing that barrier would represent acknowledgement of intimacy beyond practical cohabitation. She'd crossed it anyway. Now she occupied that space regularly, familiar with the particular way he'd arranged it. Personal items from his prospecting days displayed on surfaces, the specific blanket he preferred, despite the archive providing standard bedding, the small portable screen where he'd loaded books and media from human sources. The room carried his scent more strongly than common areas, concentrated essence of his biology, mixing with recycled atmosphere. "Tell me about your life before the archive," he'd requested during one of these evening sessions. They sat together on his sleeping platform, shoulders touching, her back against the wall, while he reclined partially across her lap, his head resting against her thigh in position that had evolved gradually over weeks. "Limited variations," she said, her hand settling naturally into his hair, fingers moving through the unfamiliar texture. "Education, specialized training. Assignment to ethnographic division, 17 years of identical routines. No family, friends, relationships? The sisterhood doesn't structure around such connections. We have colleagues, professional associations, but personal bonds are discouraged as sources of data contamination." His hand found hers, threading their fingers together. "That sounds lonely. I didn't recognize it as such. Until you." The admission generated silence. His thumb moved across her palm in small, soothing circles. Through the quarter's walls, she heard the archive's ambient sounds, atmospheric processors, the distant movement of other researchers, the constant subtle vibration of systems maintaining their isolated existence in the debris field between stars. "I was lonely too," Kyle said quietly. "Prospecting is solitary work. Sometimes I'd go months without real conversation, just my own thoughts and the void. I told myself I preferred it, that independence meant freedom, but really I was just afraid of needing anyone. What changed? Dying, apparently. Nothing provides perspective like facing your own extinction. He shifted, turning to look up at her face. Or maybe it was you, standing there on the other side of that containment window, watching me die with this expression I couldn't read, like you were fighting yourself over something fundamental. She remembered that moment with perfect clarity. The council chamber behind her, institutional pressure demanding she observe without acting, and the visceral wrongness of standing idle while possessing capability to prevent death. The decision had felt like rupture, something breaking open inside her that couldn't be recontained. I was fighting 300 years of conditioning, she said. Every principle my culture built around, and you were just a stranger, someone I'd never met. But watching you die felt unbearable in ways I couldn't explain. Can you explain it now? She considered the question seriously. Weeks of introspection, institutional analysis, personal examination hadn't generated simple answer. I think I recognized something. Some capacity for connection I'd been suppressing, and you represented opportunity to act on that recognition, to choose experience over perfect observation. So I was convenient. He smiled to indicate partial sarcasm, but genuine question shadowed the humor. No, you were necessary, the catalyst that revealed what was already present. I didn't save a random human, I saved you specifically. Something about your existence mattering felt fundamental in ways I still don't fully comprehend. His hand tightened around hers. He drew her down, their faces close, breathing the same air in the chamber's confined space. I understand, he said quietly, because I feel the same. About you, specifically. This isn't just survival gratitude, or Stockholm Syndrome, or whatever psychological term explains away genuine connection. You're necessary to me, in ways that terrify me because I know it's temporary. The 6-month deadline hung between them. Leora felt its weight, the awareness that institutional requirements would eventually reassert themselves. The Council had authorized continued cohabitation, but only as research protocol. Eventually, analysis would conclude. Eventually, she'd have to choose between the archive's culture and whatever this was becoming. We have time, she said, though the statement felt more hope than certainty. 6 months, that's substantial. It's not enough. No, she agreed. It isn't. He pulled her down further, eliminating distance until their foreheads touched, breath mingling, heartbeats close enough to feel their rhythms. Then we make it count. Every day, every moment, we make it mean something that survives whatever comes after. She kissed him. The action emerged without deliberation, pure response to proximity and emotion and the fundamental need for connection that her culture had spent centuries trying to eliminate. His lips felt different than she'd imagined. Warmer, softer, carrying taste she had no framework for categorizing, but the sensation transcended analysis. For several seconds she simply experienced the specific pressure, the way his hand rose to cup the back of her head, the gentle exploration of mouths learning each other's geography. When they separated, she felt altered. Some boundary crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The archive had documented everything, of course. Somewhere in the collective consciousness, her colleagues observed this moment, analyzed physiological responses, generated data about cross-species intimate contact. The surveillance should have generated shame or professional concern. Instead, she felt defiant. Let them watch, let them document. This moment belonged to her and Kyle, regardless of institutional observation. Their experience couldn't be reduced to data points and behavioral analysis. It existed independently, genuinely, defiantly human, despite her not being human at all. Kyle's expression suggested he understood her thoughts without requiring verbalization. The archive can watch all it wants, he said. They can't actually touch this. What we feel, what we're building together, that belongs to us. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that genuine experience could maintain integrity despite constant surveillance, that intimacy could survive institutional reduction to research material. But she'd spent 17 years understanding how observation worked, how it transformed subjects into objects, how documentation stripped autonomy, how nothing remained private under comprehensive analysis. "I don't know if anything survives observation," she admitted. "Once they've documented something, catalogued it, reduced it to patterns and probabilities, does it still exist as we experienced it? Or does it become what they say it is?" "That's a question for philosophers," Cale said. "I'm just a prospector who nearly died and got saved by someone who couldn't maintain perfect detachment. All I know is what I feel right now, in this moment, with you. And that feels real enough to trust." His simple faith steadied something in her that institutional analysis had destabilized. She settled back against the wall, drawing him with her, allowing their bodies to arrange themselves in comfortable contact. His head returned to her lap. Her fingers resumed movement through his hair. The archive watched, but in that moment, Leora found she could accept the surveillance without it destroying the genuineness of what they shared. They had 6 months. Whatever came after, they'd face together. For now, that had to be enough. The message arrived during their 8th week, encrypted through channels Leora didn't recognize as standard archive communication. She accessed it through her neural link, feeling unfamiliar protocols engage, data transferring through pathways that bypassed normal institutional monitoring. Human transport approaching archive vicinity. Independent operator requesting asylum. Council debating response. Thought you should know. Anonymous. She stared at the text, processing implications that cascaded through logical progression toward inevitable conclusion. Another human. Another rescue scenario. The Council would be forced to confront the same fundamental question her violation had raised. Did the Accord permit individuals to die when intervention was possible? Or had her action established precedent that contamination was acceptable when lives were at stake? Kyle noticed her distraction immediately. "What's wrong?" She explained the message, watching his expression shift through surprise toward something that looked like hope. "Another human here?" Approaching, requesting asylum. "The Council hasn't determined response protocols yet." He stood from his position at the workstation, moving toward her with intensity she'd learned indicated strong emotional response. "They have to help. They can't just let someone die, not after—" He stopped, awareness of her unique position crystallizing. "Not after you proved it was possible. You changed the Accord, Leora, whether they admit it or not." She wished his confidence felt justified. But she'd participated in enough Council deliberations to understand institutional resistance to precedent change. Her violation had been grudgingly authorized as research opportunity, but that authorization didn't extend to systematic intervention. The Sisterhood could maintain her as singular contaminated case while preserving general methodology. "They might," she said carefully. "They might preserve the Accord by maintaining my action as aberration rather than precedent." His face went still. They'd let someone die to prove a point. They'd let someone die to preserve 300 years of cultural foundation. That's not point-making, that's institutional survival. The distinction felt crucial. The archive wasn't being cruel or callous. It was being what it had always been. Perfect observers. Absolute witnesses. The fact that such observation required accepting death as natural outcome didn't make the Sisterhood monstrous. Just fundamentally different from humans who instinctively valued individual preservation over methodological purity. Cale moved through the quarters with agitation, his body betraying distress through pacing and clenched hands. "This is insane. You have the capability, the resources, the technology. Someone is going to die and you're debating methodology. We're debating cultural foundation, the principle that separates us from contaminating what we observe." "I'm contamination." The statement carried bitterness. "That's what you mean. I'm the variable that polluted your perfect system." She stood, crossing to him, stopping his pacing through direct contact, her hands on his arms, forcing his attention to focus on her rather than abstract institutional rejection. "You're not contamination. You're—" She searched for accurate characterization. "You're the evidence that perfect observation isn't possible. That distance doesn't guarantee accuracy, that we've been missing fundamental dimensions of what we claimed to comprehend. Then prove it. When that transport arrives, you open the seal. You save whoever's out there. You demonstrate that your action wasn't aberration, but evolution." The argument resonated with desires she'd been suppressing. She wanted to save whoever approached, wanted to establish precedent that intervention was acceptable, wanted to fundamentally alter the archive's culture towards something resembling compassion rather than pure documentation. But individual desire couldn't override institutional authority. She existed within systems larger than personal preference. "I can't," she said quietly. "The Council has already restricted my access." After our last evaluation, they implemented additional monitoring. "I don't have clearance to override containment protocols anymore." Kyle's expression shifted through several configurations before settling on something that looked like betrayal. "So they learned from your violation, made sure you couldn't repeat it. They protected institutional integrity from individual compromise. They chose methodology over life." She couldn't argue the characterization, though it felt incomplete. The sisterhood's choice reflected cultural values fundamentally different from human assumptions. Life didn't hold automatic supremacy over other principles. Observation, knowledge, methodological purity, these carried equal or greater weight in her species' ethical frameworks. Humans struggled to comprehend such positions because they elevated individual existence to sacred status. But the archive operated from different assumptions entirely. The transport's approach dominated the next 2 days. Leora monitored through standard communication channels, watching the Council debate, while knowing her opinion carried no weight. The arguments mirrored her own hearing: cultural preservation defending the Accord, long-range planning recognizing potential research opportunities, the eldest trying to navigate between competing positions. The vote concluded through collective consciousness consensus. The Accord would hold. The transport would be allowed to pass without intervention. If the asylum seeker expired through natural causes, the archive would document the process with comprehensive thoroughness. Perfect observation required perfect detachment. Leora felt the decision like physical impact. She'd known the likely outcome, but hoping for different result had generated investment in potential she should have recognized as unrealistic. Around her, the quarters felt smaller, the surveillance more oppressive, the reality of her position clearer. She existed as permanent contaminated case, authorized to continue only because her violation generated research value. But the institution itself hadn't changed, wouldn't change, would preserve its foundational principles regardless of individual suffering. Kale's response was controlled fury. He didn't shout or rage or engage in dramatic demonstration. Instead, he withdrew into silence that felt more damning than anger. He performed necessary interactions with minimal communication, occupied separate spaces as much as possible, treated her with polite distance that eliminated all the intimacy they'd built. The pain surprised her. She'd experienced isolation before, 17 years of it, without recognizing what was missing. But having known connection made its absence unbearable. She wanted to explain institutional constraints, cultural differences, the impossibility of individual action against collective will. But he knew those arguments already. He'd lived under them for weeks, accepted them as conditions of their cohabitation. This was different. This was watching the sisterhood choose methodology over life again, despite her violation supposedly demonstrating alternative possibilities. She tried reaching him during evening cycle, finding him in his chamber reviewing data on personal screen. "Kyle, I understand you're upset." "Upset?" He didn't look up from the screen. "That's an inadequate characterization. I'm furious and disappointed, and recognizing that everything I believed about your people changing, about your violation mattering, was naive fantasy. Individual actions don't transform institutional cultures immediately. Change requires time, accumulated evidence, generational evolution. Tell that to whoever dies out there while your council accumulates evidence." He finally met her gaze, expression hard. "You saved me. I'm grateful for that. But you haven't actually changed anything, have you? You're still just one contaminated observer in a system that values perfect distance over basic humanity." The accusation struck accurately. She had changed nothing fundamental. The archive continued its 300-year methodology, with one singular exception: her. And even that exception existed only provisionally, authorized for research value rather than ethical principle. "I don't know how to change institutional foundations," she admitted. "I can barely manage my own contamination. Expecting me to reform the archive's entire culture through single action seems unreasonable." I'm not expecting you to reform anything. I'm just recognizing the reality of our situation. You're part of a system that fundamentally doesn't value life the way humans do. And no amount of personal connection between us changes that institutional truth. He returned attention to his screen, dismissing her through deliberate inattention. She stood in the doorway, feeling the distance between them despite physical proximity. Something had broken that she didn't know how to repair, not through explanation or justification or any appeal to reason. The gulf between their cultural foundations had become visible in ways intimacy had temporarily obscured. She retreated to her own chamber, to solitary darkness that felt familiar despite weeks of avoiding it. The archive had documented everything, of course. Her colleagues would analyze this rupture, extract insights about human emotional response to institutional conflict, generate comprehensive understanding of attachment dissolution under ethical disagreement. Perfect observation, perfect documentation, perfect knowledge purchased through the destruction of what it claimed to comprehend. Leora wondered, lying alone in darkness she'd once preferred, whether the archive understood the irony, whether any amount of data could compensate for the lived experience of losing connection while simultaneously documenting its loss. Whether perfect observation was simply another phrase for perfect isolation, refined and elevated to cultural virtue. The transport passed 2 days later. The archive's sensors tracked it through the debris field, noted the life support readings degrading toward failure, documented the final biological signatures as the occupant expired from environmental exposure. Comprehensive data, unprecedented observations of human death through oxygen deprivation under space conditions, valuable additions to the archive's extensive files. One more human dead, one more data set. One more confirmation that the Accord's perfect detachment remained intact, despite temporary contamination. Kyle said nothing when the news distributed through standard channels, but his silence felt heavier than before, permanent somehow, as if the transport's passage had settled something fundamental about their situation that neither could articulate but both understood with complete clarity. They still shared quarters, still performed necessary cohabitation functions. But the intimacy had evaporated, replaced by careful politeness that felt worse than hostility. Leora moved through days mechanically, documented interactions for council reports with increasing detachment, recognized that she'd somehow managed to recreate isolation while technically maintaining connection. The countdown continued. 4 months remained before institutional reassessment, but the deadline felt irrelevant now. Whatever they'd been building had collapsed under the weight of irreconcilable cultural foundations. She'd saved his life but couldn't save anyone else, had violated the Accord but couldn't change its application, had chosen him specifically but remained embedded within systems that chose methodology over individual existence. Perfect observation, perfect contamination, perfect demonstration that some distances couldn't be crossed, regardless of genuine desire. The quiet lasted 3 weeks. Kyle maintained his polite distance, performing necessary interactions with minimal emotional engagement, treating her like colleague rather than whatever they'd been becoming. Leora allowed the separation to persist, uncertain how to bridge gaps that felt simultaneously profound and impossible to articulate. The archive noticed, of course. Her reports documented decreased interaction frequency, eliminated physical contact, conversational exchanges reduced to functional necessity. The council's response came through encrypted channel, marked for her attention only. Behavioral patterns suggest relationship dissolution. Clarify experimental status. Is continued cohabitation generating useful data, or should alternative arrangements be implemented? She stared at the message, feeling its implications cascade through logical progression. The council was offering her exit, recognition that the experiment had run its course, that continued proximity generated diminishing returns, that she could request separation and return to solitary quarters with institutional approval. The offer should have generated relief, return to familiar isolation, escape from constant emotional turbulence, restoration of professional boundaries. Everything she'd maintained successfully for 17 years before one impulsive decision destroyed her carefully constructed equilibrium. Instead, she felt terrified. The thought of formal separation, of Kyle being relocated to different quarters, or, worse, sent away from the archive entirely, generated visceral response that made breathing difficult. Despite current distance, despite the painful silence, despite everything, she needed him present, near, available even if currently inaccessible. She composed careful response, choosing words with precision. Relationship dissolution represents significant observational opportunity. Documenting attachment decay provides valuable data on human emotional processing under sustained proximity. Continued cohabitation recommended through current experimental timeline. The justification felt thin even to her, but it bought time. 4 more months before mandatory reassessment. 4 months to either repair what had broken or accept its permanent destruction while maintaining proximity that made such acceptance unbearable. Kyle found her in the common area that evening, his expression suggesting deliberate decision to engage despite weeks of avoidance. "We need to talk." She marked her position in the data analysis she'd been reviewing without actually processing. "Yes." He settled into the seating area with careful distance, maintaining space between them that weeks ago wouldn't have existed. "This isn't working. The silence, the distance, it's worse than separation." "Do you want separation?" The question emerged before she could prevent it, revealing vulnerability she'd intended to conceal. His expression softened fractionally. "No, but I don't want this either. This performance of cohabitation while we're both miserable. I don't know how to bridge the gap," she admitted. "Your anger is justified. My institutional constraints are real. Those facts seem irreconcilable. Maybe they are." He leaned forward, hands clasped between knees, attention focused on the floor rather than her face. "But I've been thinking about what happened, about my response, about whether I was being fair." She waited, uncertain where his thoughts were leading. "You saved me," he continued, "against every principle your culture built around. You sacrificed your standing, your career, everything you'd worked toward for 17 years, to preserve one random human you'd never met. That's not nothing, Leora. That's—" He stopped, searching for adequate characterization. "That's everything, actually. That's choosing compassion over methodology, individual existence over institutional purity, me over them. But I couldn't save the transport. Couldn't prevent that death. Couldn't establish precedent that would change the accord. No, but you're one person, one contaminated observer in a system designed to prevent exactly what you did. Expecting you to single-handedly reform 300 years of cultural evolution through one action seems," he smiled without humor, "seems like the unreasonable expectation you told me it was." The acknowledgement shifted something in her chest. "I still wish I could have done more. Could change institutional foundations, could make the archive recognize that perfect observation isn't actually perfect if it requires willful ignorance of suffering we have capacity to prevent. But you can't, and holding you responsible for systemic failures isn't fair. You did what you could, what you were able to do within the constraints you operate under. And that, saving me, violating your entire culture's foundational principle, that's actually extraordinary." She moved closer, drawn by the shift in his tone, the possibility of reconciliation shadowing his words. "I thought I'd lost you, to justified anger, to irreconcilable cultural differences." "You almost did." He met her gaze finally, expression complex with emotions she couldn't fully pass. "But I realized something during these weeks. Being angry at you for systemic problems you can't control serves no purpose. It just destroys the one genuine thing I've found in years of isolation, and that seems counterproductive, strategically inefficient," she offered, attempting humor she wasn't certain would land. He smiled, genuinely this time, warmth reaching his eyes. "Exactly. Very poor resource allocation." The tension between them relaxed fractionally, not dissolved entirely, but softened enough to permit approach. Leora closed remaining distance, settling beside him with deliberate contact. Shoulder to shoulder, thigh to thigh, the pressure of physical proximity they'd built gradually over weeks. "I missed this," she said quietly. "Your presence, the comfort of contact, the specific way you occupy space." His hand found hers, fingers threading through familiar patterns. "I missed it too. Turns out anger is much easier to maintain in absence than proximity." Sitting next to you, I mostly just feel relieved you're still here." They remained like that, hands joined, bodies touching, silence carrying different qualities than the painful distance of recent weeks. The archive watched, documented, analyzed, but the surveillance felt less invasive now. Just background constant they'd learned to exist within, without letting it destroy genuine experience. "I'm sorry," Kyle said eventually, "for withdrawing, for treating you like enemy when you're anything but, for expecting institutional change you have no power to implement." "I'm sorry too," Leora responded, "for not being able to save everyone, for existing within systems that prioritize methodology over compassion, for—" She stopped, recognizing the limitation, "for not being human enough to understand instinctively why individual life should override all other principles. You don't need to be human, you just need to be you," which apparently includes capacity for compassion your culture tried to eliminate through selective breeding and institutional conditioning. The fact that it persisted despite everything suggests something fundamental. She considered his characterization. The sisterhood had refined observation through cultural evolution, spanning centuries, but she'd never been entirely successful at the detachment they demanded. Some part of her had always resisted, preserved responsiveness that served no institutional purpose. Opening the seal hadn't created that capacity. It had simply revealed what she'd been suppressing for years. "Perhaps some traits can't be eliminated," she said slowly. "Perhaps the capacity for connection exists too fundamentally to fully erase without destroying something essential." "Humanity," Kyle offered. "That's the word you're avoiding. The capacity for connection, for compassion, for choosing individual existence over abstract principles, that's humanity. And you possess it despite not being human." The characterization should have felt inaccurate. She wasn't human, didn't share their biology or psychology or cultural foundations. But sitting there with his hand in hers, feeling the specific warmth of contact and the relief of restored connection, Leora understood what he meant. Humanity wasn't species designation. It was capacity for response that served no evolutionary purpose beyond making existence meaningful, rather than merely functional. "The Council would consider that contamination," she said. "The Council can fuck itself." He squeezed her hand gently, softening the profanity with affection. "You're not contamination. You're evolution. The archive will either recognize that eventually or calcify into irrelevance." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that her violation represented progress rather than aberration. But institutional change occurred across generations, if at all. She'd be long gone before the archive acknowledged that perfect observation required eliminating everything that made understanding possible. "We have 4 months," she said, returning to their immediate reality, "before institutional reassessment, before the Council determines whether this experiment continues or terminates. Then we make them count, actually count this time. No more silence, no more withdrawal, just—" He turned toward her, bringing their faces close. "Just us, for whatever time we have." She kissed him with the relief of restored connection, tasting forgiveness and reconciliation and the particular sweetness of recovered intimacy. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer, eliminating distance with comprehensive contact that felt like homecoming despite the profound strangeness of the characterization. When they separated, she remained in his embrace, head resting against his shoulder, listening to his heartbeat through fabric and flesh. The archive watched. 4 months remained. But sitting there, held and holding, feeling genuinely grateful for provisional reprieve, Leora understood that she'd crossed thresholds that couldn't be reversed. She was contaminated, compromised, fundamentally altered by connection she'd spent 17 years successfully avoiding. And she wouldn't choose differently, even knowing all subsequent complications. The final month began with routine maintenance, Kyle working through the archive's aging systems, while Leora observed and documented, their relationship restored to comfortable intimacy after weeks of painful distance. But something felt different. Tension shadowed interactions, awareness of approaching deadline infusing every moment with additional weight. The Council's summons arrived with 3 weeks remaining. Not Leora alone this time, both of them together presenting themselves to institutional judgment as unit rather than observer and subject. The shift in protocol suggested significance she couldn't interpret through normal frameworks. They walked to the council chamber side by side, Kale's hand finding hers despite the impropriety of such contact during formal proceedings. She allowed it, drawing comfort from his presence, even as professional training demanded detachment. The eldest waited with expanded assembly, representatives from every major division, the full institutional authority engaged rather than routine oversight. Leora felt collective attention focus on them with intensity that made breathing difficult. This wasn't standard evaluation. Something had changed. Researcher Leora. Subject Kyle. The eldest's formal address carried weight beyond typical bureaucratic language. The Council has completed comprehensive analysis of your cohabitation experiment. The data generated over 6 months exceeds all projections. We have documented unprecedented insights into human emotional processing, cross-species attachment formation, relationship dynamics under sustained proximity, and, most significantly, the limitations of pure observation methodology. Leora processed the statement carefully, uncertain whether the conclusions favored continuation or termination. The eldest's expression remained neutral, offering no advance indication of verdict. Your relationship dissolution and subsequent reconciliation provided particularly valuable data, another council member added. Documentation of attachment strain under ethical disagreement, anger processing, forgiveness dynamics, all phenomena we've observed remotely in human populations but never comprehended through direct experience. The question before us, the eldest continued, is whether experimental continuation serves institutional purposes, whether additional time generates proportional value, whether the contamination you represent offers insight sufficient to justify ongoing violation of foundational protocols. The silence that followed felt oppressive. Kale's hand tightened around hers, the only indication of tension he allowed publicly. We have determined, the eldest said slowly, that the experiment has generated sufficient value to justify permanent authorization. Researcher Leora will maintain cohabitation with subject Kale indefinitely, continuing documentation of human behavioral patterns through sustained proximity. Relief flooded through Leora's consciousness, so profound it generated physical symptoms. Accelerated pulse, released breath, the specific loosening of tension she'd carried for months. Permanent authorization, no more countdown, no more provisional existence. They could continue, together indefinitely without institutional termination. But something in the eldest's expression suggested the verdict held additional complexity. However, the eldest continued, permanent authorization requires disclosure the Council previously withheld. Subject Kale, you've been informed you represent research opportunity, direct observation of human cognition under sustained proximity. This characterization is accurate but incomplete. Kyle's posture shifted fractionally, wariness entering his expression. Incomplete how? The transport that approached 3 months ago, the asylum seeker we allowed to expire naturally, despite your objections. The eldest paused, attention focused completely on Kyle's face. That individual's death generated significant data about human emotional response to institutional failure. Your anger, Leora's guilt, the relationship strain and subsequent reconciliation, all documented with comprehensive precision. Valuable observations that couldn't have been obtained through advanced disclosure. Understanding crystallized slowly, horror dawning across Kale's features. You let someone die deliberately, not to preserve the accord, to generate data about our reactions. We preserved the accord while simultaneously extracting maximum research value from your presence. The dual purpose served institutional efficiency. Leora felt the statement's implications cascade through logical progression toward inevitable conclusion. The Council had orchestrated the transport's death, not just observed it, but actively prevented intervention to study their responses, used human suffering as experimental catalyst to document emotional processing in herself and Kale. You're monsters, Kale said quietly. The simple statement carried more weight than elaborate accusation. You let someone die to study how we'd react. That's not observation, that's manipulation, cruelty disguised as research. We are observers, the eldest corrected without defensiveness. Our purpose is comprehensive documentation of human behavioral patterns. Your reactions to the transport's expiration provided unprecedented insights. We regret the necessity, but accept it as cost of advancing understanding. Kale's hand released Leora's. The separation felt like physical wound, sudden absence where connection had existed. He stepped away from her, attention shifting between the Council and Leora, with expression that suggested profound betrayal. "Did you know?" he asked her directly. "About their plan? About using that death to manipulate our emotions?" "No." The word emerged immediately, desperate to establish innocence she wasn't certain she deserved. "I had no advance knowledge. I believed the Accord was being preserved through principle, not research design. But you're part of this system, part of their methodology. You save me, then watch someone else die for data. How is that different than what they're doing?" The question struck accurately. She'd been horrified by the Council's decision, but had ultimately documented everything, submitted reports analyzing their emotional responses, contributed to the comprehensive data the transport's death generated. She'd performed her institutional role even while experiencing personal anguish. Contaminated observer maintaining documentation despite, or perhaps because of, contamination. "I don't know," she admitted. The truth she kept returning to. The fundamental uncertainty about her own position, her own culpability, her own role in systems that valued knowledge over individual existence. The Council watched their interaction with clinical attention, documenting this moment with the same comprehensive precision they applied to all observations. The irony struck Leora with visceral force. Even their response to learning about manipulation was being studied, analyzed, reduced to data points about human and near-human emotional processing under institutional revelation. "Permanent authorization stands," the eldest stated, seemingly unconcerned by Kale's obvious distress. "You will continue cohabitation, continue documentation. The Council requires ongoing observation of your relationship dynamics." "I refuse," Kale said. Simple statement, but carrying absolute conviction. "I'm done being your research subject, done performing for your institutional curiosity. Send me back to human space or find other quarters. I won't continue this." The eldest's expression finally shifted, mild surprise as if she hadn't considered the possibility of refusal. "You have limited options. The archive maintains no transport capability. Human authorities have no knowledge of your survival. Returning you creates diplomatic complications we're unprepared to manage. Then I'll take my chances in escape pod, die trying to reach human space. At least that would be my choice rather than your experiment." Leora felt something crack inside her chest. "Kyle, don't." He turned toward her, expression hard. "You're part of this. Maybe you didn't know about their specific manipulation, but you're embedded in systems that make such manipulation possible. That prioritized data over life, over basic humanity." The accusation was accurate. She'd spent 6 months documenting his existence, submitting reports that fed institutional analysis, performing observer role even while experiencing genuine connection. She'd believed she could separate personal response from professional duty, maintain authentic relationship while simultaneously reducing it to research material, but perhaps that separation was illusion. Perhaps contamination meant becoming implicated in everything the archive represented, regardless of individual intentions. The Council dismissed them without resolution. Kyle returned to quarters they'd shared, began gathering his limited possessions with systematic precision. Leora stood in the doorway, watching him prepare for departure she couldn't prevent, feeling the comprehensive destruction of everything they'd built. "You don't have to leave," she said quietly. "The Council will find alternative arrangements, other quarters, reduced observation protocols." "They'll never reduce observation. That's their entire purpose, watching, documenting, reducing life to data, and you—" He stopped, voice catching. "You made me believe connection was possible, that we'd built something genuine despite surveillance, but it was all performance, research material. My emotions transformed into experimental data. It wasn't just that." She moved toward him, needing him to understand. "What I feel for you, what we've shared, that's real. Regardless of institutional frameworks, regardless of how the Council uses the documentation. How can it be real when every moment exists primarily as research opportunity, when my anger and your guilt and our reconciliation all feed their comprehensive analysis? We're not people to them. We're variables. Fascinating, contaminated variables. She had no response that wouldn't sound like justification. He was right. The archive had used them, manipulated their relationship, orchestrated situations to maximize data generation, and she'd participated through documentation, through reporting, through maintaining observer role even while experiencing genuine emotion. Kyle finished packing. His few possessions fit easily in the small bag he'd requested from Maintenance Division. He stood at the quarters exit, hesitating at the threshold, attention returning to her face one final time. "I loved you," he said quietly, "or I was learning to, despite everything, despite the surveillance and the institutional frameworks and the knowledge that we were being studied. I genuinely felt—" He stopped, shaking his head. "But I can't maintain that connection knowing it serves their purposes, knowing my emotions generate valuable data. It destroys something fundamental." "Where will you go?" Leora asked, voice breaking on the question. "I don't know. Away from here. Away from observation. Maybe I'll die trying to reach human space. Maybe I'll find some isolated corner of the archive where your sensors can't reach. It doesn't matter. I just need to stop being your experiment." He left. The door closed behind him with finality that felt like ending rather than pause. Leora stood alone in quarters that suddenly felt vast and empty, surrounded by observation equipment, by data streams, by the comprehensive documentation of relationship that had just collapsed under the weight of institutional manipulation. The archive watched, recorded her distress with clinical precision, generated valuable data about attachment dissolution, about genuine grief processed by a contaminated observer who'd learned, too late, that connection couldn't survive reduction to research material. Perfect observation, perfect documentation, perfect demonstration that some experiences destroyed themselves when subjected to comprehensive analysis. 3 days passed in isolated routine. Leora moved through necessary functions mechanically, reviewing data, submitting reports, maintaining the fiction of professional detachment while experiencing emotional devastation that made breathing difficult. The quarters felt haunted by Cale's absence, every surface carrying memories of shared existence. The Council's response arrived with expected bureaucratic efficiency. Her reports documenting Cale's departure and the relationship's dissolution had generated significant discussion. Another summons, another evaluation, another moment of institutional judgment. She presented herself to the council chamber with resignation rather than anxiety. Nothing they decided could make current circumstances worse. She'd lost Kyle, lost the connection that had made contamination feel worthwhile. Whatever institutional consequences followed seemed irrelevant. The eldest waited alone this time, without the expanded assembly that had delivered previous verdict. The intimate setting suggested unofficial communication rather than formal proceeding. "Researcher Leora, your most recent reports demonstrate significant emotional distress." The understatement would have generated humor if Leora retained capacity for such response. The subject's departure created complications. Yes, unanticipated complications. The eldest leaned forward, expression carrying something that almost resembled concern. "The council miscalculated. We designed the transport scenario to generate data about emotional processing. We didn't anticipate it would destroy the primary experimental relationship entirely. You manipulated his trust, his fundamental security. He can't maintain connection while knowing institutional forces orchestrate suffering to study his reactions. We recognize that now. The human capacity for trust violation exceeds our modeling parameters. We've generated valuable data about relationship dissolution, but at cost of losing the ongoing observational opportunity you represented." Leora processed the characterization with detachment she'd spent 6 months learning to abandon. "You regret losing research access, not causing genuine harm." The eldest expression didn't change. "We regret both," in that order. The brutal honesty felt almost refreshing. At least the sisterhood didn't pretend emotional concern they didn't experience. They valued data. They designed scenario to maximize information generation. The fact that such design had destroyed human relationships was unfortunate, but secondary to research objectives. "The question," the eldest continued, "is whether recovery is possible." whether the subject can be persuaded to resume cohabitation, whether you possess sufficient influence to repair the damage institutional manipulation created. You want me to convince him to return, to continue being your research subject, despite knowing you'll orchestrate additional suffering to document his responses. We want to preserve valuable experimental conditions. Your feelings about the subject created unprecedented observational opportunities. His feelings about you generated equally significant data. The relationship's restoration would advance understanding considerably. Leora felt something cold settle in her chest. They were asking her to manipulate him, to use whatever genuine connection remained to restore experimental parameters, to become active participant in institutional exploitation rather than contaminated observer. No, she said. Simple statement, but carrying absolute conviction she'd never previously demonstrated in council presence. The eldest's expression sharpened. You refuse direct order. I refuse to manipulate someone She stopped, recognizing the truth she'd been avoiding. Someone I love, for institutional purposes. You've already destroyed our relationship through orchestrated cruelty. I won't complete the destruction by actively deceiving him. You violate your institutional role, your purpose, the foundational protocols that structure your entire existence within the archive. Yes, the admission felt like release. I violate all of it, because I've finally recognized what 6 months of cohabitation should have taught me immediately. Perfect observation is impossible when it requires destroying what you claim to understand. You can't comprehend human connection while systematically preventing yourselves from experiencing it. You can't document love while orchestrating its dissolution. The methodology is fundamentally flawed. Silence filled the chamber. The eldest regarded her with expression Leora couldn't pass through normal frameworks. Surprise, consideration, something that might have been recognition. You're advocating for systematic methodology change, complete abandonment of the Accord's foundational principles. I'm advocating for acknowledging that we've been studying life while refusing to live, that comprehensive documentation without comprehension is empty exercise. That may be, she paused, gathering courage for statement that would complete her institutional destruction. Maybe humans understand something fundamental that we've eliminated through cultural evolution. That connection, vulnerability, emotional engagement. These aren't contaminations to be avoided, but essential components of genuine understanding. This is significant deviation from sisterhood protocols. This is what 6 months of contamination taught me, that I'd rather experience genuine emotion and lose perfect objectivity than maintain detachment that prevents actual comprehension. The eldest leaned back, attention distant, as if engaging with collective consciousness Leora couldn't access. Several minutes passed in silence before she refocused on Leora's presence. The council has reviewed your position. We find your arguments disturbing, but potentially significant. You represent data point we didn't anticipate. Full cultural conversion from sisterhood protocols to human-influenced frameworks through sustained proximity. Your transformation itself constitutes valuable observation. I'm not research material. Leora felt anger rising, genuine fury she'd never previously experienced in institutional context. I'm person experiencing consequences of your manipulation. Stop reducing everything to data points. That's our entire purpose. What we've built our culture around for 3 centuries. Then perhaps your purpose is incomplete. Perhaps perfect observation isn't actually perfect if it requires remaining fundamentally ignorant of what you observe. More silence. The eldest's expression carried complexity Leora had never seen in her features. Uncertainty, consideration, something approaching doubt about institutional foundations. What would you propose? The eldest asked finally. Alternative methodology that preserves observational integrity while acknowledging emotional dimensions. Leora hadn't anticipated the question, hadn't prepared argument for systematic change, but possibilities crystallized as she spoke. Embedded observation. Researchers living among human populations, experiencing connection while documenting patterns. Maintaining enough distance for analysis, but accepting emotional engagement as necessary component of genuine understanding rather than contamination to eliminate. That's not observation. That's participation. Maybe those aren't separable, Maybe claiming absolute division between observer and observed is convenient fiction rather than methodological reality. The eldest considered this with obvious discomfort. Leora's proposal challenged 300 years of cultural evolution, suggested the sisterhood's entire methodology was built on flawed premises. But something in the eldest's expression suggested she couldn't simply dismiss the arguments, not after comprehensive documentation of Leora's transformation demonstrated lived consequences of sustained human contact. "The council requires time to deliberate," the eldest said finally. "Your position represents significant challenge to institutional foundations. We must determine whether your contamination generates valuable insights or simply demonstrates failure of proper conditioning." While you deliberate, Kyle remains isolated, probably attempting to reach human space in inadequate vessel, potentially dying because your manipulation destroyed his trust. You care about his survival beyond research parameters. Obviously. Leora didn't attempt to conceal the emotional weight. "I love him, not as observational subject, but as person who matters specifically and individually. Your documentation probably captured the progression comprehensively. But knowing you watched doesn't change the reality of what I feel. Love." The eldest tested the word as if examining unfamiliar concept. Emotional attachment serving no survival function. Generating vulnerability without compensatory benefits. Compromising objective judgment. Also generating meaning, connection. The specific quality that makes existence worthwhile rather than merely functional. Leora met the eldest's gaze directly. "You can document it perfectly and still miss the essential dimension, that it feels necessary, despite serving no logical purpose." The eldest dismissed her without additional comment. Leora returned to empty quarters, to solitary existence that felt unbearable after months of shared occupancy. But something had shifted during the confrontation. She'd stated positions clearly, refused institutional demands, prioritized genuine emotion over professional obligation. For the first time since opening that containment seal, she felt entirely certain about her choices. The archive might terminate her employment, exile her from the only culture she'd known, destroy her professionally, but she wouldn't compromise what remained of her integrity by manipulating Kale's trust for institutional purposes. Some things mattered more than perfect observation. She'd finally learned that fundamental truth. Leora accessed the archive's internal tracking systems without authorization, using credentials she technically shouldn't possess for purposes explicitly outside her institutional role. The sensors showed Kale in the maintenance sectors, deep infrastructure areas rarely occupied, where environmental systems and power generation created enough ambient noise to potentially interfere with comprehensive surveillance. She found him 3 levels below residential ring, in narrow passage between atmospheric processors, the space barely wide enough for human navigation. He sat with back against massive recycling unit, portable screen displaying what looked like star charts and trajectory calculations, planning his escape, mapping routes toward human space through debris fields and vacuum. He noticed her approach immediately, expression hardening. "I told you I was done being observed. I'm not here as observer." She settled carefully into the confined space, maintaining distance he'd demanded while desperately wanting to cross it. "I'm here because the Council wants me to convince you to return, to resume cohabitation and experimental protocols." His laugh carried bitterness. "Of course they do. Can't waste valuable research opportunity." "I refused." The statement made him pause, attention sharpening. "I told them I wouldn't manipulate you for institutional purposes, that I love you beyond research parameters, that their entire methodology is fundamentally flawed." Silence filled the narrow passage, broken only by atmospheric processors' constant drone. Kyle studied her with expression she couldn't interpret, searching for something in her features. "You refused direct council order," he said finally. "That destroys your entire career. Everything you built over 17 years. Yes, worth it though. To maintain whatever integrity I have left, they'll terminate your employment, exile you from the archive." Probably. She'd accepted that consequence during her confrontation with the eldest. "But I won't prioritize institutional standing over genuine connection. They've already destroyed our relationship through manipulation. I won't complete the destruction by actively deceiving you." He moved closer, eliminating some of the careful distance. What you said to them about loving me, did you mean it? Or was it performance for their observation? The question struck at the fundamental uncertainty, shadowing everything since the transport's revelation. How could anything feel genuine under comprehensive surveillance? How could emotional truth survive constant documentation and institutional analysis? I don't know how to prove authenticity, she admitted. Everything we've shared exists primarily as data, every moment documented, every emotion reduced to physiological markers and behavioral patterns. But what I feel, she pressed hand against her chest, over the organ that had developed new rhythms since opening his containment seal. This feels real, regardless of how they categorize it, regardless of institutional frameworks. You matter to me, specifically and individually. That truth persists despite everything else. Even knowing I'm trying to leave, planning escape that will probably kill me? Especially knowing that. She reached toward him, hand extended, requesting rather than assuming contact. I don't want you to die attempting impossible journey. Don't want you isolated in maintenance tunnels avoiding surveillance. Don't want any of this. I just want... She stopped, recognizing the impossible desire. I want what we had. Before the Council's manipulation, before trust violation, before everything became research material. He took her hand, fingers threading through familiar patterns, the contact generating warmth she'd missed with physical intensity during their separation. I want that too, but I don't know how to rebuild it, how to trust that anything between us exists independently of institutional observation. Maybe it doesn't. The admission felt dangerous, but necessary. Maybe we can't separate genuine connection from documented observation. Maybe the surveillance is permanent condition we have to accept, rather than obstacle to eliminate. That's depressing philosophy, but possibly accurate. The archive watches everything. They'll continue analyzing us regardless of formal cohabitation. We can't actually escape observation. We can only choose whether to let it destroy what feels genuine. Kyle pulled her closer, eliminating remaining distance until they occupied the same confined space, bodies pressed together by necessity and choice simultaneously. I'm scared, he admitted quietly, of being manipulated again, of my emotions serving institutional purposes, of discovering everything I feel is just fascinating data rather than authentic connection. I'm scared too. She wrapped arms around him, feeling his warmth and solidity and the particular way their bodies fit together, despite significant physiological differences, but more scared of losing you entirely, of you dying in escape attempt, of spending however long I have left, knowing I prioritized institutional integrity over attempting genuine connection, even contaminated connection, even relationship that exists primarily as research material, even that, because contaminated connection is better than perfect isolation. Because experiencing love while knowing it's documented seems preferable to experiencing nothing while maintaining methodological purity. He kissed her, the contact carrying desperation and relief and the specific quality of reconciliation after painful separation. She responded with matching intensity, letting herself feel everything she'd been suppressing, the fear and longing and profound gratitude that he hadn't actually left, that escape attempts remained theoretical rather than executed. When they separated, he kept her close, foreheads touching, breathing synchronized. If we do this, if we return to cohabitation despite knowing the Council orchestrates situations to study our reactions, we need different terms. Complete honesty. No performance for observation purposes. If they manipulate circumstances, we acknowledge it openly rather than pretending institutional frameworks don't shape our reality. Agreed. The proposal felt like foundation for something sustainable, despite impossible conditions. Transparency about observation, recognition that surveillance shapes our experience, refusal to pretend genuine emotion exists independently of documented analysis. And if they push too far again, orchestrate additional suffering for research purposes. We resist, together. Make our opposition clear, even knowing it generates data about resistance patterns. She smiled without humor. Contaminated observers maintaining contaminated relationship under permanent surveillance, while refusing to let institutional analysis destroy what feels essential. That's complicated existence. Yes, but better than alternatives. Better than you dying in inadequate vessel. Better than me returning to perfect isolation, having learned exactly what I'm missing. He helped her stand, both of them navigating the confined passage back toward residential areas. The archive's sensors would have documented everything: her unauthorized access to tracking systems, the conversation in the maintenance sector, the reconciliation and physical contact. The Council would analyze it all, extract insights about human emotional processing under institutional manipulation, generate comprehensive understanding of relationship repair dynamics. But walking back to quarters they'd shared, hand joined with his, feeling genuinely hopeful despite everything, Leora discovered she could accept the surveillance without it destroying the experience. They were observed, documented, reduced to fascinating variables in institutional analysis. But the connection felt real despite those conditions, authentic despite being catalogued, theirs, even as it became everyone's data. Some contaminations were worth embracing. Some violations of protocol generated meaning that justified every consequence. Some relationships mattered enough to maintain despite, or perhaps because of, their 1856 impossible conditions. She'd chosen him over institutional foundations once already. She'd choose him again repeatedly, for however long circumstance permitted. Perfect observation could document everything, while understanding nothing. But she'd experienced genuine connection. She knew the difference between existing and living. That knowledge was its own form of data, the kind no amount of surveillance could adequately capture. 6 months after their reconciliation, Leora stood before the Council with a proposal that would either transform the archive's methodology or complete her institutional destruction. The comprehensive documentation she'd compiled sat ready in shared consciousness, evidence accumulated through sustained observation of her relationship with Kyle, demonstrating patterns the sisterhood's remote surveillance had consistently misinterpreted. Human emotional bonding requires participation, she stated, her voice carrying confidence that surprised even herself. Remote observation captures behavioral markers but misses essential dimensions: the specific quality of trust formation, the vulnerability required for genuine attachment, the way shared experience creates meaning beyond quantifiable metrics. The Council listened with varying degrees of skepticism. Some members had reviewed her data, recognized the gaps between their previous interpretations, and lived reality she'd documented. Others maintained traditional positions, defending 300 years of methodology against individual contamination. "You propose systematic embedded observation," the eldest said, summarizing Leora's detailed presentation. "Researchers living among human populations, experiencing connection while documenting patterns, accepting emotional engagement as research tool rather than contamination to eliminate. Yes, with transparency about observational purposes. Humans are aware they're being studied in controlled contexts: medical research, psychological experiments, anthropological fieldwork. Such awareness doesn't prevent authentic behavior if researchers maintain ethical protocols and genuine relationships. The accord exists to prevent contamination, to preserve data integrity through absolute distance. The accord exists to prevent us from influencing what we observe, but we've been influencing through absence, creating artificial conditions by removing ourselves from contexts we claim to study. Embedded observation acknowledges that perfect distance is impossible and attempts more honest relationship with research subjects. The representative from cultural preservation objected predictably. This abandons foundational principles, 3 centuries of methodology built on pure observation. 3 centuries of increasingly incomplete understanding, Leora countered. We've documented human civilization exhaustively, while missing fundamental patterns, because we refuse to experience the conditions that generate behavior we analyze. We study family bonds without forming families, analyze grief without experiencing loss, document love without permitting attachment. Our data is comprehensive and fundamentally limited. Kyle had helped her prepare the arguments, contributed human perspective to methodological proposals. He sat in the observation gallery now, officially present as research subject but functionally participating in institutional deliberations. His presence represented the hybrid future she was proposing, humans and sisterhood members collaborating rather than maintaining rigid separation. The debate continued for hours. Leora presented case studies from human anthropological traditions, demonstrated ethical frameworks for embedded research, outlined protocols that would maintain observational integrity while acknowledging researcher participation. Some council members resonated with her arguments, others rejected them entirely. Consensus seemed impossible. Finally, the eldest called for formal vote. The measure required 3/4 approval to implement systematic methodology change. Leora watched the collective consciousness engage, felt the institutional will crystallize toward decision. The vote concluded, 68% approval. Not enough for immediate implementation, but sufficient to authorize experimental protocols. 5 researcher teams would be embedded within human populations for 2-year observation periods. They would live among subjects, form genuine relationships, document patterns through participation rather than distance. Comprehensive analysis would follow, determining whether embedded methodology generated insights sufficient to justify abandoning pure observation. Researcher Leora will lead the first team, the eldest announced. Her experience with contaminated observation positions, her ideally for implementing embedded protocols. Subject Kale will accompany as cultural liaison and human perspective consultant. Relief flooded through Leora's consciousness, so profound it generated physical symptoms. Not complete victory, the sisterhood hadn't abandoned the accord entirely, but meaningful progress. Recognition that perfect observation might require accepting imperfect participation. That understanding sometimes demanded experiencing, rather than merely documenting. The council dispersed. Leora found Kale waiting outside the chamber, his expression suggesting he'd monitored proceedings through available channels. When she emerged, he pulled her into embrace without concern for institutional observation. "You did it," he said against her shoulder. "Actually changed their methodology, made them acknowledge limitations in perfect distance. Partial change, experimental authorization, complete transformation requires generational evolution. Still significant. You took 300 years of cultural foundation and introduced doubt. That's extraordinary." She held him, feeling the specific comfort of his warmth and solidity and the particular way their bodies fit together. Around them, the archive continued its endless work, sensors documenting human civilization from vast distance, while slowly acknowledging that such distance might prevent genuine comprehension. "We'll be living among humans," she said, processing the implications. "Actual human communities, not controlled observation conditions, but messy, complicated, genuine social contexts." Nervous? Terrified? She smiled against his chest, and excited, and profoundly curious about what we'll discover when observation includes participation. "You'll be documented the entire time. The other researcher teams will analyze your embedded observations. You're still research subject, even while conducting research." Yes, that irony isn't lost on me. But I've learned to exist under surveillance, without letting it destroy genuine experience. We both have. He pulled back enough to see her face, expression carrying the specific warmth she'd learned to recognize as love. Despite the sisterhood's insistence, such recognition required contamination. "I'm proud of you, for arguing institutional change, for refusing to accept methodological limitations, for choosing experience over perfect detachment. You made that choice possible. Gave me context to recognize what pure observation costs. Demonstrated that connection has value despite, or perhaps because of, its complications." They returned to quarters they'd shared for over a year now, familiar spaces transformed by accumulated experience into something resembling home despite institutional observation. Leora had learned to distinguish between documented existence and genuine living. Had discovered that surveillance couldn't actually touch certain dimensions of experience, the specific quality of waking beside someone who mattered, the comfort of shared routines, the profound satisfaction of being known completely despite systematic analysis. The archive would continue watching, would document their embedded observation with comprehensive precision, would analyze every interaction, every emotional response, every moment of connection they formed with human communities. But that documentation couldn't reduce their experience to mere data, couldn't eliminate the meaning they'd built together, couldn't destroy what felt essential, despite existing primarily as fascinating variables in institutional analysis. She'd opened that containment seal 17 months ago, acting on impulse she couldn't explain through analytical frameworks. The choice had contaminated her methodology, destroyed her professional detachment, transformed her from perfect observer into compromised participant. But standing there with Kale, preparing to embed themselves within human civilization, feeling genuinely excited about uncertain future, Leora understood that contamination had been necessary evolution. Perfect observation was impossible. Perfect understanding required accepting imperfection, acknowledging participation, experiencing the messiness of genuine connection rather than maintaining sterile distance. The sisterhood had spent 3 centuries avoiding that truth. She'd learned it through violation, through contamination, through choosing one random human's existence over institutional principles, and she wouldn't change anything. Not the violation, not the consequences, not the complicated relationship that existed under permanent surveillance. Because she'd learned to live rather than merely exist, had discovered that some forms of knowledge couldn't be obtained through pure observation, had experienced love despite, or perhaps because of, its documentation. The archive would continue its work, would either evolve toward embedded methodology or calcify into irrelevance. But she'd already changed, already crossed thresholds that couldn't be reversed. She was contaminated observer, compromised researcher, person who'd learned that perfect distance prevented perfect understanding. And in that recognition existed its own form of data, the kind that required experiencing to comprehend, the kind that surveillance could document but never fully capture, the kind that made existence meaningful rather than merely functional. She'd saved one human's life through impulse she couldn't explain, had reformed institutional methodology through arguments built from lived experience, had learned that love persisted despite observation, that connection survived documentation, that some truths could only be understood through participation rather than distance. The archive watched everything, but some things remained beyond comprehensive analysis. Some experiences transcended reduction to data points. Some relationships mattered despite, or perhaps because of, their impossible conditions. Leora had learned those lessons through violation and contamination and the profound strangeness of loving someone while simultaneously documenting that love for institutional analysis. The knowledge had cost her perfect objectivity, professional standing, 3 centuries of cultural foundation. Worth it, though, worth everything, because she'd learned to live.